Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today we are diving into Stone Temple... Oh my gosh, I'm going to keep saying that. You remember Stone Temple Pilots? Remember that band from a long time ago? I keep wanting to call this Stone Temple Devotional, which is like completely not what it is. Today, we are diving into Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. This is a book that I would see occasionally, on the front tables of my local bookstores. And honestly, it was not actually a book that really grabbed me. When I finally did pick it up, I then listened to a couple of interviews, and two of the interviews were talking about how this is like a very quiet book. And on some level, I was like, gosh, it was so quiet that I just didn't even hear it calling to me from those front tables of those bookstores. But when I finally did dig into this book, I just was so absolutely compelled. In many ways, I do think it is a quiet book. It is not a book that is teeming, with dialogue, but it is a book that has a very strong voice. It's actually painted on a very kind of broad canvas in some ways. It's a really fascinating look at a phenomenon that I don't think that many people understand, this idea of becoming, a cloistered nun. But it also, within that framework, taps into some very important, really profound universal feelings that I think a lot of us can relate to. I just found it absolutely gorgeous. I also, for a quiet book, I was just floored at the richness of the prose. For those of you who like an agenda, we're going to do a very quick bio of Charlotte Wood. Then we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about the title, the structure of this book, and the opening. We're going to dig into some of the prose at the very beginning. We're then going to talk about this notion of the book as not being judgmental. I recently just did a thing on Lori Moore, and I was struck when I was looking at the short fiction of Lori Moore at what an incredible way she has of presenting us with characters who are sometimes deeply, deeply flawed, but she does not judge these people. And in some ways, the people are not even judging themselves. It's a fascinating thing to have an author who truly is presenting us with someone where there is very, very little judgment. So we'll talk about the non-judgmental part. We're then going to dive into the prose. This is a woman who writes with all five senses. I was going to say all four senses, but they're five. She writes with all five senses. When I did my 3/4 of that MFA program, one of the things that they taught us is if you can involve all five senses, then you'll end up with a text that's much richer. I will tell you, I think a lot of people strive to do this, and it can be a bit of a pitfall when someone is trying to really tap into, your sense of smell or your sense of touch or your sense of hearing. It's a little bit treacherous. It's not easy to pull off. She does it so well. We're going to look at some examples of that. We're also going to just look at the verbs. Again, for a book that feels kind of quiet and kind of spare and sort of hauntingly kind of lonely. Now I'm just kind of riffing. But for a book that feels like that in many ways, the verbs are so strong. It was so noteworthy to me, the way that she is choosing verbs that are very active and unique and that really, I think, add quite a bit. We're going to talk too about how the prose does feel very spare, but in many ways it feels incredibly rich, and we're going to look at why that is the case. We're then going to talk briefly about the role of mothers in this book. We're going to talk about the sense of place in the book, and then we will look at the close. And quick note at the top here, I'm going to kind of assume that you have read this book, but it's also not a book where they're major spoilers. I don't feel like I'm going to be able to really spoil anything for you. There is actually a huge amount that is kind of going on in this book. It's not to say that there isn't plot, but, in many ways, Wood is not building this whole thing around some kind of plot that is going to be subject to a lot of spoiling. In terms of biography, Charlotte Wood was born in 1965 in a place called Cooma, Australia, Cooma. This is up on something called the Monaro Plains. I say up because it's at higher elevation. This is a part of Australia that's barren. I mean, there's incredible... We're going to talk about this later, but there's a really beautiful sense of place. And she said in one of the interviews that I listened to that she really wanted to write about the place where she was from. And she does an incredible job of that. She grew up Catholic, which was important for me to hear. I mean, I don't think I would have just been shocked if she were not Catholic, but it's an interesting thing to know, just because the attitude of our protagonist about the Catholic Church, there is some ambivalence. She's really drawn to it in some ways and kind of repelled in others. And so it's actually, I'm not someone who has to really dig into autobiography, and I don't particularly care if if a narrator shares a lot of information, sort of autobiographical information with the author. But I also do like it. It's human nature, I think, to have a sense of like, where is this person speaking from? And in some ways, I do think, speaking of biography, that Charlotte Wood is inviting us to conflate our narrator a bit with Charlotte Wood herself. We have an unnamed narrator. It's a first-person narration. All of that kind of invites you in some ways to conflate author and narrator. She said that there's, and I think this is a direct quote, there's enormous beauty and comfort in Catholic ritual, but there's also a really important aspect of acknowledging the terrible things that the Catholic Church has done. The thing that she speaks of in the book was the treatment by Catholic nuns of infants and young mothers. Claire Keegan writes about this beautifully in Ireland. And in this book here, too, we have that notion of the mass grave of all of the young mothers and infants. So we have some ambivalence about the Catholic Church that I always really appreciate. We're not getting, kind of a single view here, and we're not getting answers on what we should think about the Catholic Church at all. In fact, if anything, she's kind of problematizing our sense of it, but it's a really interesting exploration. Another aspect of the biography that kind of lines up well with our protagonist is this idea of the death of both of her parents. So Charlotte Wood's dad died when she was 19. Her mom died when she was 29. Her mom died of brain cancer. And there was a note about how she carries a lot of shame, or at least she did carry a lot of shame, about how grief-stricken she was at the death of her parents, which is such an interesting concept. I feel for her. I'm like, what's coming to mind is what everyone kept telling me after my mom died, which is like, there's no wrong way to grieve. So I want to say to you, Charlotte Wood, even 3 decades after your mom died, there's no wrong way to grieve. I hope that you honestly, she did say that she wanted to write a book, that was about where she grew up, but also that was about her mother. So her mother died 3 decades ago. She hadn't ever really explored this. So I like to think that in this exploration of the mother here, also a very interesting take on her relationship with her father. In some ways, it seems like she had a much less. I'm really here conflating our author and our narrator. In a short passage we're going to look at, she speaks about feeling really understood by her father. There was a mutual understanding, and you get the sense that she didn't quite have that with her mother. So I'm hoping that Charlotte Wood has a lot less shame, certainly now, about the way that she was grieving, but also that she's a bit at more peace. Well, she's at a bit more peace with the death of her mother after having written what is just like a beautiful examination of the complexity and the richness of the mother-daughter relationship. Importantly, speaking of biography, Charlotte Wood wrote this at the beginning of COVID. So in Australia, there were really, really serious lockdowns. My niece's boyfriend is Australian, and I just remember he and his whole family, there are 4 people in the family, and went to Australia, and they had to spend 2 weeks in one hotel room, like a small hotel room with 2 queen-size beds. And I remember just thinking, like, how on earth does someone do that? Apparently they had like little stations in the room, and they would like do little exercises occasionally in the stations of the room. Honestly, kudos to the Wood family. Also, their name is Wood. I'm really like outing my niece's boyfriend here. I am fairly certain that there is no relationship with Charlotte. Although this is crazy, my niece's boyfriend's sister is also named Charlotte Wood. Pretty sure, because she's like 20 years old and she now lives in she might be like 15, that she is not in fact the Charlotte Wood who wrote this book. All of that is to say that when Australia, in the beginning of COVID, Australia was really hardcore about the lockdowns. So Charlotte Wood herself, Charlotte Wood, the author, was fascinated by this idea of isolation and really wanted to think about this question. And the whole book is an exploration of this question, the question of like, what would make someone want to become a cloistered nun, specifically someone who does not have the religious conviction that many nuns would. This is a perfect time for a brief little segue, which is actually kind of an insane thing about my past, which is that my mom went to a Catholic high school, like a Catholic boarding high school in California, Santa Catalina in Monterey, which is like a far, far cry from some of the hardcore Catholic institutions that we know. But I had known, obviously, that she had gone to this Catholic school. And she said to me at one point that she really wanted to be a nun. And so I, of course, was left with this idea that my mom was like, had this kind of ardent, sneaky Catholicism. She was Episcopalian, My older brother and I were baptized Episcopalian, and then my parents kind of like ran out of steam, and the younger two siblings were not baptized anything. But I had this feeling, like kind of through my whole life, that my mom had this like more ardent Catholicism happening, like some sort of deep-seated desire to be a nun. And not until I had a child and was thinking about faith and my own children was I asking her about this desire of hers to be a nun. And I had assumed the whole time that my mom, unlike myself, had like, faith in God and heaven and all of these kinds of Catholic trappings, which is blasphemy to say it like that. But I said something to her about this, about her like Catholic conviction. And she was like, what? She's like, I don't really believe in God or certainly not in heaven. But she said that what really appealed to her was the lifestyle, like that being a cloistered nun or at least living in an abbey was like kind of a dream for her, which is such an interesting thing. And it's also very interesting in terms of this book because what we have here is a lay person who is, choosing to essentially turn away from a lot of the worldly aspects of her life and join a cloistered community, which apparently was something that really also appealed to my own mother. Okay, we're now going to dive on into the book. The first thing we're going to take a look at is the title. If you are here to become a better reader and to get more out of your reading experience, all you really need to do is slow down and pay attention. I feel like I say that every time, but paying attention to the title can often really tell you a lot about your reading experience to come. So I loved this title. I love the artwork on the front of it. There is, again, a spareness and a quietness to it. I like the fact that we have this juxtaposition between stone yard, which sounds kind of like austere, but not in like a nun kind of way. It sounds kind of like medieval or something. I think in my mind, I'm thinking like Stonehenge, or I'm in fact thinking of this stone kind of, constellation of stones here that is on the cover of the book. But you have this nice juxtaposition between stone yard, which seems very rocky and austere, and devotional, which to me speaks really to kind of, some of the more kind of Baroque aspects and the more kind of codified aspects of the Catholic Church. So a devotional, it can mean several different things, but it can be like a period of prayer. It can be acts of prayer or acts of devotion. All of that is meant to inspire kind of more faith and more commitment to worship. But a devotional can also be an object like a book or a hymnal, something, again, that inspires devotion and supports, worship, but it's almost like a hymnal or something. So this idea of a stoneyard devotional can actually be a book. I like the idea of the title of the book, which is obviously describing the book itself, is giving us this idea that in many ways what we are holding in our hands is a devotional. It is something that is inspiring, not necessarily worship, but it is inspiring like a kind of awe, frankly, and like which I do think this book inspires awe. I mean, there's a lot of really kind of crazy things. I'm thinking of the mouse plague here, but also like the perseverance of human life and the really serious sorrow and grief. There's this book is really tackling some really important things in ways that feel subtle, but the idea of taking it seriously and adding the gravitas of like the notion of something like a devotional is so appealing. I think it's pointing us in a couple of different directions and really underscoring some of the ambivalence and the kind of kaleidoscopic view that we are going to get of Catholicism, because in many ways it's just grounded in the place. It is, about things that are, totally inscrutable and unmovable like stones, but it also has to do with this idea of devotion and religious fervor. And I did look up Stoneyard. I thought maybe that was a place in Australia. It is not. But this fictional place that she is imagining is on the Monaro Plains. Obviously, we spoke about that earlier. I would imagine that what she is imagining is very much like Cooma, Australia, which is, again, these high, austere mesa, kind of high elevation, but large, flat, kind of plain-like areas. So then we're going to dive into the book here. The dedication is for Jane Palfreyman, and this is apparently her editor and publisher. I had not read any Charlotte Wood before this, but it seems like she's got kind of like this excellent cult following. A lot of her work, she has a book that's very important to apparently a lot of young women in particular. And I believe that book has to do with kind of environmental collapse and environmental crisis. And we certainly see that in this book because the mouse plague is nothing if not an indication of the world of nature being out of balance. Wow, did I feel for those people in Australia in 2020 and 2021. Not only did they have COVID lockdown happening, but this is a real thing in New South Wales. I think that's what it's called. There was like a crazy mouse plague. I am not actually that bothered by rodents. I have a real hard time with insects. I'm not great with insects. We've got some rodent problems for sure in our life. I actually grew up, not only did my sister have rats as pets, which made the whole thing better for me, but we also had a lot of rats, just in our house, which is crazy. We had a lot of ivy. Apparently ivy is it's like a little hotel. It's like a little, neighborhood for the local rats. But even I, who do not have a problem with rodents, was like, wow, this whole mouse thing is really something. I also will I say this with a slight badge of pride. We used to ski a lot in a little cabin up in Lake Tahoe. And more than once, twice in fact, once in an after ski boot and once in an actual ski boot, I put my foot in. One time it was a mouse nest. I like to say mouse. Pretty sure they were mice up there. One time it was an actual dead mouse. Another time it was a little mouse nest. As I'm saying this, I'm very proud of myself that I don't have more of a mice problem, but I certainly have other issues. We also have a cat who was constantly leaving mice for us. It was the most interesting thing. Apparently, when you have a cat and they are bringing, rodents or any kind of offering, she brought bunnies and lizards and one time a crow. She was a badass. She was a tiny cat, but ferocious beast. And she would always bring all of these gifts to our youngest son. And he was reading about it. And apparently cats will bring the prey, the gift, to the person of the household that they are most worried about. So we thought this was hilarious because our youngest son, apparently Tabitha, was very worried about him. And then he went off to college, and literally the next morning she brought a gigantic rat into my husband's office. And I was like, oh my gosh, guess who Tabitha is not worried about? Because guess who is really ruling the roost here? That would be me. No one is worried about me, certainly not Tabitha. On a more literary note, too, obviously this plague is totally biblical. Not only is it a true thing that happened and it shows this environmental crisis and the idea of nature being out of balance, but it is also so biblical. There's nothing so biblical as a plague, and this absolutely is that. Okay, so I just really got a little bit off-piste there, but now we're back on track. So the book is dedicated to her editor and her publisher, and then we have two epigraphs. The first is by Nick Cave. I felt chastened by the world. So the idea of chastened is so interesting to me. In some ways, it links back to this idea of shame. I hope this doesn't have, a ton to do with her idea with Charlotte Wood's, a shame about her grief around her parents dying. How traumatic. There's something about having your second parent, your mom, die when you're 29 that seems, just particularly gnarly to me. But this idea of being chastened, there is a sense of shame and kind of a reproof that you're receiving. And the idea of being chastened by the world is so interesting. In terms of religious stuff, chastening can be a punishment. And the idea of being chastened by the world, in some ways, it's not even by God. It's everything that you, even if you, so say you're not a believer, the world, if the world is chastening you, it's everything. It's sort of inescapable in a way that I found really moving and actually very sad. We then have this second epigraph. This is by the novelist Elizabeth Hardwick. This is what I have decided to do with my life just now. I will do this work of transformed and even distorted memory and lead this life, the one I am leading today. So I love this idea of this being work, of this being something that someone is wholeheartedly dedicating themselves to. There's that beautiful part in the very first part of this book where she is our narrator is kind of beginning to feel, well, she's not even in the rhythm of the whole thing yet, but she's understanding how often they are doing these religious rites, how many times a day that they're all gathering together. It's not a chapel, it's the church. They make a good distinction between chapel and a church. A chapel, I guess, is public. I think that was the distinction. And this is a consecrated church. So when they're meeting so often, our narrator, as someone who is just there from the outside and initially just there for a visit, she's like, how do they ever get anything done? And then she realizes, in fact, that the work is the prayer. The work is the gathering and the singing and the praying. So I like this epigraph that reminds us of the idea that we can choose the kind of work we want to do, and we can choose the level of devotion that we have to that work. But these are, I really like these epigraphs. I think she's giving us a good indication of why, if you're feeling chastened by the world, it would be really nice to just move out of the world. And then the idea of really dedicating yourself to work and understanding that, in the case of our narrator, it's not necessarily a type of prayer, although it is a type of attention that she is paying to things. It's a type of, really being very conscious and very intentional about how she is living her life. We then have we have this page that says part 1. The book is separated into 3 parts. The first part is so interesting. We have her, I think she's there for 5 days. This is when we have our narrator, and we're going to take a look at this opening. She's clearly come here to visit. She's having an unspecified crisis of some sort. We have the sense that it has to do with her marriage, but also with the work that she has chosen to do. And she is suffering this like crazy fatigue and a lot of emotional exhaustion. What was shocking to me is at the end of part 1, she leaves. I was like, wait, because you get the sense that she's going to come here and she's going to stay. Like, you know, I think on the jacket copy and like when people talk about it, they're like, oh, it's a woman who leaves her life. So at the end of those 5 days when she leaves, I was like, wait a second, it's an excellent ending too, because she's like, maybe I'll go to that sushi place. And you're like, wow, that is very worldly. That is not like of a piece with this religious seclusion that she had been choosing. But I think that was so genius, because what that does for you is help you understand that she, like any one of us who is not necessarily interested in becoming a cloistered nun, we have this, I keep saying cloistered, I'm not totally sure. I mean, she doesn't become a nun. That's not what's happening here. And she's certainly not a cloistered nun, but she's like she's living with nuns, and in many ways she's living this kind of cloistered life. But importantly, when she's there for the first visit and then she leaves, you as the reader can identify much more strongly with her. She is not someone who is going and kind of easing herself into this life and knowing that this is the life she wants. In fact, she's much more relatable, because I think a lot of us could, I mean, in some ways this seemed very, desirable. The idea of just being able to sort of disappear for a minute and catch your breath and sleep and just think, although being alone for 5 days and thinking without like a lot of contact with the outer world does not actually sound that great to me. But that first part really does allow us to become much more kind of related to her and see her as someone who is much more like the reader, the average reader, than someone who's decided to live with nuns forever. The second part is the bulk of the book. It's like, I don't know, 225 pages or something. And it speaks, we have the idea of the mouse plague. We have this question of Helen Perry bringing back the bones of this sister. We get ourselves really kind of embroiled in the life of all of these nuns who are living there. We also have really beautiful incursions into the past. We're learning about our narrator when she was a young girl. They're really beautiful kind of episodic things. There's that gorgeous part where she's talking about, as a young girl, being friends with someone whose dad like managed the car dealership, and how they would go, on the weekends and at night and be in these cars at night. There are these very kind of vivid and specific episodic things that she's serving up that are really powerful in terms of allowing us to understand, kind of her life and why it is that she has gotten to this place. Insofar as we're ever really invited to know, I think in lots of ways there's a beautiful way in which that stuff is not too spelled out. We don't know what the crisis is. We don't know what went on with her marriage exactly. There are lots of unanswered things that are beautiful, because I think in many ways they allow us to relate to them and allow us to kind of fill in the gaps with our own experience to understand a little better why it is she has chosen this path. The third part, it's so funny. I did like a decent amount of thinking about like kind of why there was a break at the end of the second part and moving into the third. Because some of the storylines, the Helen Perry one, for example, continue from part 2 into part 3. One thing that I like, part 2 spans kind of a longer amount of time. In part 3, we have this quick thing about autumn and winter. So you get the sense of things kind of like finishing. But I really like the idea that the book ends with some things feeling kind of more explored, but with nothing kind of feeling super resolved in a way. The Helen Perry thing, actually, like her relationship with her mother in some ways does feel like there has been some kind of closure. Helen Perry's mother in many ways running kind of parallel to the idea of what our narrator is thinking about her mother. It's really interesting to have those two dyads, to have the Helen Perry and her mother, in contrast and in comparison to our narrator and her own mother. And it's not like readily apparent to me why we have first, second, and third parts, but I like the idea of the third part as offering some sort of closure. Okay, we're going to dive in now to the actual text itself. It's interesting. I was tempted to look at the openings of part 1 and part 2 because they're very different. Obviously, it's the same narrator who's telling us this, but in this first chunk, it's almost like a prelude or like a preface or something. We have a woman who is, kind of removing herself from her life, and she's going through what it's like a very literary and kind of religious thing, this idea of like the dark night of the soul. She's going through this kind of trial and then is going to emerge as a different person in many ways. So in some ways, the person we are seeing at the beginning of part 1 is not the same person that we are seeing at the beginning of part 2. Importantly, when part 2 starts, she has been at the monastery, the abbey. She has been out at Stoneyard with these nuns for some time. So really, in many ways, the person we're seeing at the beginning of part 1 and part 2 is a very different person. But obviously, there are many similarities of the prose. So we're going to look at day 1. This is on the first page of the book. Arrive finally at about 3. The place has the feel of a 1970s health resort or eco-commune, but it's not welcoming. Unbelievable. Couple of things right away. We have a lot of fragments in this book, and I really like that. Arrive finally at about 3. So there's an immediacy there. There's an intimacy there. We almost feel like we're reading a journal. We feel like there's a certain shorthand that she is using with us as the reader. But there's also, when you have fragments, so it's not a complete sentence, there's no subject here, you should be thinking to yourself about like the fragmented nature of the person. This is someone who's not putting together complete sentences. This is someone who is feeling fragmented, and that is conveyed in their speech. There's also a very interesting thing that's happening here. You can assume as the reader, because this is all told in the first person, that what she means here is like, I arrive finally at 3. So she's just taking out the I because this is kind of like this notational, language that she's using. But the other thing on some very deep level is that arrive finally at about 3 is also, or it can be read also, as an imperative. So it can be the second person, like arrive at 3. Like, you should arrive at 3. And it's not, I think most people don't read it like that because very quickly you realize we're in the first person. And novels in the second person, especially the second person imperative, are not that common. So I don't think you're ready for someone to open it with like, arrive at 3. But you do have this sense of there is a subtle sense here of the imperative. And I also love from the beginning, we're getting this kind of like, again, this kind of juxtaposition, this kind of strange and fragmentary vision of what we have here. So like a 70s health resort or an eco-commune, those are different things in some ways. And also like they speak to very different things. Although both of those are important because we have this idea of the 70s was important for our narrator because there was a lot of like religious stuff that was happening in her town, a lot of evangelical kind of strange kind of groups, like the Moonies and the Hare Krishna, but like there was a lot of that kind of religious fervor that she speaks about. And also the idea of an eco-commune. This is someone who not only deeply concerned about the environmental, crisis, but someone who has actually worked her whole entire life toward the idea of saving the environment. And we're going to get to, how that's going. But right from the beginning, it seems like she's just kind of tossing these things out. But these descriptions are very important in terms of telling us like who this person is and why she is here. So we hear that it sounds like a 70s resort or an eco-commune, but it is not welcoming. Hugely important. Signs on fences or stuck on little posts by driveways. No entry, no parking. A place of industry, not recreation. So again, a lot of this is fragmentary. It's also these nice snapshots, so we are getting a sense of what it all looks like. I park in a nondescript spot near a fence and sit in the quiet car. So again, we have an unnamed first-person narrator. The first-person narration, it's very fitting for this book because in many ways, the first person allows for a lot of confession. This feels like a very confessional book in lots of ways. I also have made a little note here. The quiet car, I've made like little hash marks under the Q and the C. There's something so beautiful about this kind of, we have this fragmentary kind of, staccato description, and then she's sitting in the quiet car. There's something, I am not a big person like for alliteration, generally don't love it, but here there's something about it that struck me as so beautiful. Also car, because of that longer vowel, it's very kind of soothing, and you get a sense of like you can almost feel it. I don't know why exactly, but the quiet car, it's like, when the car is so warm and you're just like, oh, I'm just going to sit here in the car a little longer. Notably, after this, we have a big space break, and then we have another paragraph. This is a book, this seems kind of obvious and not like that noteworthy, but it is really important. If you have a book, like each one of these paragraph chunks, the first part is not indented. subsequent paragraphs are indented, but not the first one. And you have these big chunks of text that are separated by these big blank spaces. This is a book that has a lot of space. There's a lot of white space on the page. There's a lot of like quiet in it. And it does also lend itself not only to like the fragmentation in this very first paragraph also points to the fact that the whole entire thing is going to be very fragmentary. We're going to be jumping around. We're going to be talking about, the past, but we're going to be popping around in these different places. And she's going to do that structurally in this very economical way, which is she's not going to try to provide, transition. She's just going to jump from one to the next. It's also a really beautiful way to describe what this narrator is going through, both in terms of her thought process while she is here. If you're lying on the floor exhausted or sitting in a consecrated church for 5 days in like a stupor of exhaustion, you're going to be having all these kind of crazy different thoughts. And what we are getting here is a good indication of that. So importantly, we go from this kind of unwelcoming start and her sitting in the car, and we go back to just that afternoon, and we feel the very strong presence of her parents. We have this. On the way here, I stopped in the town and visited my parents' graves for the first time in over 30 years. It took some time for me to find them in what is called the lawn cemetery. The newer part fenced off. Why? From the original town graveyard with its crooked rows of tilting white headstones and crosses. The old part is overlooked by enormous black pine trees. Ravens and cockatoos scream from their high branches. The lawn cemetery, by contrast, is a dull, flat expanse filled with gently curved rows of low, ugly headstones of identical dimensions. Neater, I suppose, but why should a cemetery be neat? There is no lawn, just dusty, dead grass. To find my parents, I had to recall the cold, unsheltered feeling I had, physically I mean, at each of their funerals. It's so beautiful. It's also so rewarding and always so interesting to go back to the beginning of a book after you have finished it. She's giving us so much information here and really emphasizing her loneliness and her grief. We don't have a lot of information here. We never know the details of like the actual, kind of like fine details about the deaths of her parents. At this point, we don't know if they died together. We don't know how old she was. This reminds me of the book The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard, who is also, it's a pair of young Australian girls who are also orphaned. But you have this sense of like not knowing what this backstory is. And in many ways, that is so intriguing and adds a lot of tension. Okay, and then right across the page, the end of this kind of chunk of text reads this. I stood on the grass and looked at the ugly flowers, then at my parents' names carved into each slab in front of me. And I realized, your bones are here beneath my feet. I squatted then, those few feet of earth between their bodies and mine, and I kissed my fingers and pressed them to the crackly grass. It's so good. I mean, again, fascinating to go back and look at this because this notion of her parents' bones as being in the ground is something that really resonates with this idea of the nun, the Australian nun who has gone far away. I believe she's in Asia, and she is killed there, but they want to repatriate her bones. They want her to be buried in the Australian soil. It's also at the end of the book, the beautiful ending of this book, our narrator talks about how important it was for her mother. The kind of example that she's using is like the idea of compost. This is a woman who always believed that everything had the right to return to the soil. So we have this beautiful vision, like a page and a half into the novel here, of the importance of things returning to the soil. And we see that in a bunch of different ways. And we have a beautiful, like, full circle ending because she does talk in the very end about the privilege that her mother had or how important it was for our narrator to honor this idea that her mother would return to the soil. It's so beautiful. The other thing we have here, when she kisses her fingers and press them to the crackly grass, this is a good indication of all of the ways that we are going to see wood use the senses, all five senses, so effectively. Also the birds throughout, there's a lyrebird, which I don't know what that was, but a cockatoo, the idea of a cockatoo flying around, just like randomly in the graveyard. They're very subtle ways that we really do have a sense of Australia as being very like Australian. So I want to move on to talk a little bit about this idea of this text as being very non-judgmental. That was something that Wood herself articulated in an interview that I listened to. And it's like in many ways like the key to the whole entire book. It helps you understand, I think, a little bit why things feel kind of drifty and kind of not totally like locked down, because she's not giving us any kind of judgment. Like even, I mean, there's a little bit, and there's a lot of kind of, she has some shame about how she treated Helen Perry, but that was a very specific thing. But there's some things that you clearly have a sense of how she is feeling about them. But a lot of what is happening is like you as the reader are simply observing it, and there is not judgment on the part of the author, which is a very hard thing to do. So I want to look at page 22. This is in the very first section in part 1. It's day 3 of her time. And I think especially in the beginning, when you might expect her to be giving thoughts on the Catholic, nuns who are here, we have her judgment is kind of reserved at this point. And we have these kind of beautiful descriptions that are really curious and interesting and like providing a lot of like food for thought. So on 22, we have this. Day 3. Slept deep and long this time. I covered the exit sign with my jacket last night so it was much darker, and without any wind the night was quiet. In Lauds again, I wonder if they think boredom is a sin. Do all religions include some form of this repetitive movement? It feels ancient, superstitious. Walking in circles, bowing and prostrating, kneeling and standing. What is its purpose? Eradication of the ego in some way? Denying the human craving for newness or escape or surprise, returning and returning and returning, a prescribed revisiting. Watching them do their thing, I wonder if the nuns annoy each other. This is so good. I mean, you can hear a little bit of judgment here, but it's actually very important in the beginning because we're kind of with her as readers and we're like, yeah, what are we meant to be thinking about all of this? But even as, she's like a little bit of an indication. If she's talking about something being superstitious, there's a little bit of like skepticism there. But then she has this beautiful idea of returning and returning and returning and the comfort in that. And then at the end, the idea of like, do the nuns annoy each other is so beautiful because she's reserving I mean, you get the sense that like some of these nuns are like annoying to her. And it is beautiful because throughout the whole entire thing, we do see the nuns annoying each other. This is not, she's not giving us like some kind of like beautiful, like beatific, like just kind of hagiography of what it is to be a nun. This is like, she's really talking about what it is to be a human being. And of course, all of these different women are there for different reasons. There is one point, there's a woman named Carmel who is a nun and she has left her adolescent children. It's like a 16-year-old girl, no, like a 14-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl. And I was like, for some reason, the 14-year-old boy, like having your mom leave and become a nun. And it is like, I mean, as a reader, I was like, what is happening here? And in that case, there is a little bit of judgment on the part of our narrator, but she's judging it a little bit like this does not seem right. And it's difficult for me to understand why this woman would make this choice. But she also is like, she must have had her reasons for making her choice. It is a book that is helping us, like we have this thing of like, wait, is this kind of some weird superstitious right that these people are just like deluding themselves about? But then you have the possibility of that not being the case. So even when she talks about things being non-judgmental, she's like kind of even one step beyond that in the sense that she's inviting a little bit of judgment and then helping us kind of move beyond the judgment, which is such a beautiful model, frankly, for relating to any human beings. The book is so beautiful in so many ways, and like in big ways, like in ways that like would help us like live better as humans in this like subtle and real and detailed and relatable way that I find stunning. Wow, they should just like print that up somewhere because I really just went crazy there about all of the good things this book is doing. And before we dive into some quick analysis of the prose, I just wanted to touch on a couple of important things. At one point in one of the interviews, Wood was saying that someone described the book to her as a book about a woman who is unsubscribing from her life. And there is, like, that's a very modern way to put it. There's that beautiful passage where we have our narrator, before she decides to come back, before she leaves the real world, to come back and actually stay at the monastery / abbey. I think abbey is women and monastery is like either men or women. Clearly, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I did teach English and Spanish right when I was out of college. I taught at a Benedictine monastery in Portola Valley in California. It was a dream. I was with all of these Benedictine monks. The motto was ora et labora, so like truth and work. We would have these faculty meetings. They had just let in young women, so I was like 19. I was not 19. I was 21 years old, although like some of my students were 19. They needed lay teachers and they needed women teachers. They paid me $19,000. Maybe that's why I thought I was 19. I loved that job so much. We would have these faculty meetings where we would spend all this time talking about like the nature of truth and like these deeply philosophical things that were so, oh God, it was incredible. I've never actually worked that hard in my life. I was exhausted all the time, but it was such an incredible experience. But still, that was a monastery. So I know that was not, in fact, an abbey, but the difference is not entirely clear to me. But getting back to this idea of the woman unsubscribing from her life, before she goes in to stay for long term at the abbey, she's unsubscribing. And they have that the author gives us that list of all of these different, very important environmental organizations that she's unsubscribing from. So you have this idea of someone who is deciding to really turn her back on her marriage and her job and her friends. The friends are actually very angry with her. It's a radical decision that she makes. And one of the things that Wood has said is she wants to explore that idea of why someone would do that. And there are two, she gives us like these very succinct and nice kind of like guiding principles. One is Joan Baez, which is that action is the antidote for despair. Actually, I have to look for a second. It's actually action is the antidote to despair. And that is attributed to Joan Baez. So we have, this is still in the very beginning of the book. This is when our narrator is still trying to figure out what she's doing. And as the reader, you don't really understand why she is there and what she is doing. But you have this idea that she is someone who's been very, she's an activist. Literally, that is her title. So we have this idea that action is the antidote to despair, Joan Baez. But then right underneath it, we have first, do no harm, by Hippocrates. So you have this, and Wood has been very clear about articulating this. This is a woman who has tried and tried and tried to sort of save the planet, and nothing has worked for her. Like she feels like in many ways what she is doing is futile, if not destructive. So instead of like living her life, with this idea of action instead of despair, she's pulling toward this idea of first do no harm. There's this idea that if you step out of the world as one person and stop disrupting things and stop flying in airplanes and driving around in your car and doing all these environmentally destructive things, that in some ways that kind of withdrawal is the more potent thing in terms of the environment. I mean, obviously this is highly arguable, but it's a really interesting and beautiful thing that she's giving us really early in the book. It's page 26. These two kind of guiding principles that in many ways are kind of this juxtaposition and these two poles that our author is trying to figure out. In fact, Wood talked about it like that. Like her life is kind of this constant toggling back and forth between these extremes. One is like crazy activism and the other is like a complete withdrawal from the world. It's beautiful how succinct and concise and economical she is with these quotations from Joan Baez, which is funny, and then also Hippocrates. Okay, we're going to touch briefly on some of the aspects of the prose that make it so incredibly rich, even while it feels very kind of spacious and very spare. So one of the ways she's doing that, again, is by including all of the senses. On page 10, we have this beautiful description. Actually, it's not beautiful. It's like totally jarring in a way that's really telling and excellent. My phone vibrates, its buzz making me jolt. Alex has landed at Heathrow. His new colleagues are to collect him. I reply, then lie back on the floor again. Neither of us has said it yet, but we both know I won't be following. We both know he'll be relieved. So there are a couple things here. The buzz, my phone vibrates. So all of these vibrate, buzz, jolt, these are words that are, again, like really tipping us off to how these feelings feel like in our body. Then even the idea of Alex, like the X sound there is like kind of abrasive in a way that makes that's kind of jangly in an interesting way. And then the idea of her lying back on the floor, even the word floor, there are different ways here that she's really engaging our sense of feeling, of like how things are feeling in the world. Then right across on page 11, we have this idea of them being in the church. There is another congregant a few pews behind me. A man's quiet, low voice, a throat clearing softly now and then. The singing is mesmerizing until I find the right page in the booklet and discover that the lyrics are all about denouncing evil this and God's enemies that. The subtlety of the lilting chant belies the blunt instrument of the words themselves. This is such a beautiful, kind of like a description of sound. First of all, the man's quiet voice, the low throat clearing softly now and then, all of those different vowels together in the throat. You have this idea of really what that would feel like. The singing is mesmerizing. The word mesmerizing is so beautiful. I didn't know that literally comes from the name of like a guy Mesmer. Some guy named Mesmer was going around hypnotizing people. And so the mesmerizing, to me, it sounds like it should be Greek or something, but apparently it's like Mr. Mesmer. As I'm saying all that, I'm like, is all of that true? Because it seems like something I might have just like dreamed up because it's so odd, but I would not have dreamed that up. So if you're on YouTube, I will confirm, in fact, that Mr. Mesmer is the reason we say mesmerizing. But this is another example, too, of this idea of like things being very beautiful and then understanding that underneath them, the message is not really like what you want to be holding on to. So that kind of like the idea of things not being what they seem and the importance of investigating, but also the importance of like trying to understand things and withholding just like snap judgments. All of that is really beautifully held in this one short passage. All of the descriptions of voice in this book are so beautiful. So one of the things that she's doing here, obviously it's a quiet book in the sense that it's not a book that has like tons of action and doesn't have like a lot of like crazy things happening. Like it's a book that's about being quiet, but it also is reflecting the quiet of the space. But then the voices are so clear and so kind of like primary in lots of ways, and what the voices are standing for and what they're up to. All of that is so beautifully rendered. So on page 15, and this is in the beginning when she's starting to get to know the nuns, and the singing is one way, their voices are one way that she is sort of entering into their world. So on 15, we have this. Their singing is a chiming, medieval sort of sound, unexpected and unbalanced, yet melodious in those thin, reedy voices. They sing everything very slowly. It's hypnotic. The words seem to make no sense. There's a lot about evildoers trying to destroy the psalm's narrator. All day long they crush me. Foes and enemies intent on massacre and annihilation. All this warbled by a bunch of nuns way out here on the high, dry Monaro plains far from anywhere. It's so beautiful. It also feels just like so biblical in a way that is really intentional and very effective. I want to look at one last example of this idea of the way that she is describing or using all of these senses, both the visual and the auditory and the sense of temperature. So on page 37, we have this. A heavy spring frost this morning. Crossing the grass, I made a clean track of footprints, deep green on the white spread of the lawn. It returned me to my childhood, to the sense of secret authority, imprinting one's presence into a place with those clear, sharp prints. I exist. The private, pleasurable sound of the finest layer of ice breaking beneath the weight of each step. So beautiful. It's just like, it's just gorgeous. And what's crazy about that, I didn't even notice this until just now. That is the very first, that's the first little paragraph of the second part of the novel. So we have the 5 days of this like kind of dark night of the soul where she's in this kind of stupor. And then we have the presence. We have this idea of her marking her territory and becoming like very involved with all of her senses in the land itself, but also imprinting herself like on the place, naming the place here. Both thinking about herself as a child when she was a child in the same place, and then also like re-entering it with this idea of the colors and of the sound. It's just such a gorgeous way for us to enter into this idea quietly, and like she's by herself, which is significant, but she's really like in some ways kind of staking a claim in this second part of the novel. And we're not going to take long to look at the verbs. We just looked at that one, the jolt, that the phone vibrated and it buzz jolted her. We have all kinds of verbs like that throughout. At one point, she uses the verb plonk. We have slurp. We have burbling. There are all these different very, like in the midst of very kind of spare, fragmented, like quiet kind of descriptions, we have verbs that are so strong. Anyone out there who's trying to be a writer knows that you really want to rely heavily on verbs. You definitely don't want to be relying on adverbs. And you want things to be as concise as they possibly can be. Strunk and White will tell you should always use fewer, if there's any way to have fewer words, you should have fewer words. And a really strong verb allows you to do that. But what else is happening here when she's using these verbs like plonk is you really do have a sense of engaging all of the senses. There's something, it's like an onomatopoeia kind of thing. You have a sense of that verb is actually reflecting to the reader what it would have to the character. That is a terrible way to describe that. But I think I know what you mean. Wow, I think you know what I am meaning there. So we've talked quite a bit about the sense of place here and the importance of returning to this place. We're not going to get too deeply into the idea of nature being imbalanced, and that's one of the main reasons we have the mouse plague. But you do have a sense of the inhospitable nature of the land here, but also the incredible beauty of it and the way that our narrator is so deeply comforted by returning to this space of her childhood. Returning to her childhood also has a huge amount, obviously, to do with the idea of her mother. So Wood said, even before I heard her in the interview say that she was wanting to write about her mother and that this book is an exploration of her mother, you would have known that. I have many notes in the back of the book. The fact that we have, again, that other dyad, the Helen Perry, relationship with her mom, there is a real emphasis here on motherhood. And interestingly, our narrator does not have children. I don't know if Charlotte Wood has kids or not. I think probably not. I'm just thinking back on my experience of her Wikipedia page. I do not think she does, although don't quote me on that. But certainly our narrator here does not. So you really have this sense of, it's not a woman who's thinking about her, the experience of motherhood as both a daughter and a mother. It is someone in middle age who is really thinking about her mother and what it is to be the daughter of that mother. And I'm gonna read just these quick paragraphs on 110 and 111. The second part is important because it has to do with her father. But what's crucial here to me, and what you should maybe focus on as I'm reading this, is the way that she's not trying to give us an understanding of who her mother was. This is someone who is kind of shadowy and a little inscrutable and a little stoic, but you have a sense of the mother-daughter relationship being hard to understand and hard to kind of grasp hold of. And she's not trying to fix that. She's just trying to present it as it is. And I find that so incredibly moving because they're not, I think a lot of us feel like that about our mothers. It's very hard to get a grip on who your mother is. It's that's just a human thing. It's too big and too important and too kind of primary and too much a part of yourself, even if it feels like your mother's really not a part of yourself. It just is, there are many ways that I think that she does a beautiful job of showing the complexity and the difficulties in trying to kind of really comprehend this relationship. So on 110, we have the scene where she was having those pains in her legs, and her mother takes her to this doctor. Her mother was also kind of very different than a lot of people in town. She was, again, into composting. She was into conservation. She was very much she knew who she was. She was from England. In many ways, she was kind of an outsider. And there are ways that were not very comfortable for our narrator as a younger person. But in retrospect, she's deciding in many ways that her mother was being really true to a set of her own kind of morals, and that she was very generous of spirit and she was very supportive and really non-judgmental. It's in many ways a very beautiful description of the mother. And I found this to be kind of the heart of that, because in this scene, the doctor is not being sympathetic to the daughter and is saying she's kind of a baby and is being really not great with her. And the mother is very protective in a way that we don't necessarily expect. When it was done, I was allowed to peel myself from the sticky vinyl seat. There again is that sense of feeling, of the tactile experience. And my mother paid the fee. The man said several more treatments would be necessary, and my mother said she would be in touch about another appointment, but we never went back. We didn't speak of it after that day. My mother trusted me, and I trusted her. The tightness in my calves came and went, but eventually I forgot about the pain, so it must have subsided sometime in my teenage years. As I grew into my 20s, then 30s, and learned about other mothers, the complications and layers of hurt and mistrust, of envy and control, and about the confusion so many of my friends still carried about who was parent to whom, I began to understand how rare such a simple and powerful trust had been. I wished again that I had been able to say any of this to her when she lived, yet I doubt I would have ever said it. There was a quiet but potent aura of unknowability about my mother, and I think now that to say such things would have felt like an impertinence. So beautiful. It's just such a beautiful description of how complicated this relationship is. We have then a space break. I have sometimes thought it wrong to be so preoccupied with my mother and not my father. But at the same time, I understand why. My father and I knew each other, absolutely. And I'm convinced that had he lived a long life, I would never have known him more completely than I did as a child. I don't know why that should make such a difference, but it does. This is so beautiful. That is the end of a chapter, which is also significant. And she's not telling us like a lot of stuff about her father. She's not going into who he was. It's just this real sense of this understanding that they have that is so meaningful, especially in juxtaposition with the mother. We're getting the sense of really being inside an exploration that helps us to understand our own relationships with our parents, but also just is so poignant and, again, without judgment and complex and just really, really truthful. I mean, truthful, is that what I mean? Just, I think poignant and open and generous in a way that I think is unusual and really beautiful. So to close today, I just want to read, I'm going to read the last couple of paragraphs at the very end of the book. If you haven't finished it and you don't want to hear the end, then obviously I can thank you right now for tuning in, and I can wish you happy reading. If you want to hear, I'm not going to do a lot of analysis. I just would like to close with it because it's just such a beautiful way to close what is, I think, a very beautiful novel. So on page 292, lying in bed in the dark morning. At last, after all these weeks, the rain has really stopped and the birds are out, and I can hear the burbling of the chickens. The mouse plague, it seems, is finished for now. Then she has a beautiful memory of, not a beautiful, she has like a very difficult memory of a dog, her dog Peggy, who died when she was young. And then that's like a, kind of long-ish paragraph. Then we have a space break, and then this. My mother said that anything that had once been alive should go back to the soil. Food scraps went into the compost, of course, including meat and bones, despite the general advice against this. Paper, torn into strips to allow air and microbes to move freely through. She would cut old pure cotton or silk or woolen clothes into small shreds and compost them too. Fish bones and flesh, linen tea towels. She reluctantly left out larger pieces of wood, but longed for a wood chipper. She left cane furniture to rot and then buried it. She quoted a Buckingham Palace gardener she had once seen on television who added leather boots to his compost bin. All that was needed was time and nature. Anything that had lived could make itself useful, become nourishment in death, my mother said. I never knew anyone else who had her reverence for the earth itself. Oh my God, so beautiful. I mean, this idea of ending, like the reverence, her reverence for the earth itself is it's such a beautiful way that that Wood is finishing this idea with the mother and in a way that is very satisfying. It's so helpful too. Like spring is coming, the mouse plague is over. We really do have kind of an optimistic feel here. And then this optimistic sense of the mother as returning to soil and becoming kind of regenerative. And then the beautiful, beautiful ending. I never knew anyone else who had a reverence for the earth itself. So beautiful. I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to say another word except that I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I hope that this gave you an even deeper appreciation for this gorgeous book, and I hope you come back and listen to something again soon. Happy reading.